going on, guys? Jim Surratt, Hammer Strength Conditioning, coming at you today. Been a minute since we've added some content, educational content to the YouTube channel, so I want to throw some out there today. So here at Hammer Strength and Conditioning, we run the Conjugate method, which I've spoken about at length over a number of different videos, especially with during my time at First Group. And one of the videos that I had created was on why the Conjugate method is so effective for tactical operators, right? And I stand by that video. I stand by the premise put forth in that video. But what I want to talk about today is more specifically why Conjugate method is effective for law enforcement and first responders, okay? So with the tactical population, so when I say tactical in this sense, usually it covers a wide variety of professions, right? So there's the military, there's first responder, law enforcement, that kind of stuff, right? So it really covers three or four main different avenues. What I'm going to refer to today, if I say tactical, what I mean by that is law enforcement or first responder versus military, right? So today, like I said, we're going to talk about why the Conjugate method is so effective and appropriate for training law enforcement and first responders, right? So in my tactical population video, I basically argued that because of the level of necessary readiness of the tactical population, especially or in particular the military, the Conjugate method is most effective because the way the Conjugate is broken out by developing maximal, dynamic, and then repetition effort strength, you're basically trying to raise all qualities at the same time versus something like linear periodization where you're raising either intensity or volume, or block periodization where you're focusing on a certain or a particular quality for one training block, 4 to 6 weeks, whatever it may be, before moving on to the next, and then thereby losing some of the transfer of training that you developed in the previous block as you progress to the second, third, and fourth block, right? So typically block periodization goes accumulation, which is higher volume, transmutation, which is a combination of moderately high volume and moderately high intensity, and then realization, which is where you're peaking for an event. So high intensity, low volume. And there's nothing wrong inherently with the block periodization model. However, what it does is it leads you to a singular point in time, right? So if you are, let's say you're a powerlifter, right? And you want to train, you know you have a meet coming up. Okay, you can do block periodization because it ramps up in intensity and ramps down in volume. And it peaks you in strength, if that's what you're training for that particular event. If you're a track athlete or a field athlete, you know, that can also be a useful application or a useful arena for an appropriate arena rather for utilization of the block periodization model. However, when it comes to training law enforcement and first responders, the requisite level of readiness and preparedness experienced and demanded by those professions sort of precludes and prohibits the utilization of the block periodization or the linear periodization models because they don't keep you constantly at a high performing level. They peak you, and peaking is not necessarily high performing, right? So if we're looking across time, if I want to be performing well or being a high performer across a span of time from now until whenever, if I'm peaking for a singular event, I'm basically incurring unnecessary volume, unnecessary fatigue in my accumulation phase, and I'm tacking on to that, even though my volume is reduced, I'm increasing intensity through my transmutation phase, and I've peaked my intensity into my realization phase. So basically what happens again is that when you transition from block 1 to block 2 to block 3, the training effects that you accumulated or that you were exposed to and adapted to in the previous block bleed off and taper off and fade away by the time you get to blocks 2 or 3, okay? So again, as a member of the law enforcement or the first responder community, you have to be ready to go at all times, right? You don't get an opportunity to train in a peaking manner for your profession. So with the Conjugate model, or the Conjugate method, because we raise all qualities, maximal strength, explosive strength, durability, endurance, all those things, at the same time, we can elevate preparedness to a much higher threshold so that when called upon, first responders and law enforcement are much more readily able to execute their duties, okay? So one could argue that, well, the Conjugate method is really just about developing maximal strength, right? Well, that's partially true. but there's so much more to it than that, right? And you could also argue that, well, as a cop, let's say we're a cop, right? I just need to be very strong, or I just need to be very fit. Both are not wrong, or neither is really wrong necessarily. But in order to be a high-performing professional, it is my opinion that you need a combination of both maximal strength and maximal endurance, as well as explosive ability, durability, resilience, etc. Right? So if I were to design a program for the law enforcement first responder populations, I would focus on a few different things. I would focus on, obviously, the development of maximal strength, because it is my professional and personal opinion that maximal strength is the trait or characteristic or quality that lays the foundation for all other traits, characteristics, or qualities that are expressed physically, right? So the stronger you are, the more force you can produce, the more readily you can produce that force. So there's force production, which is your strength, and there's rate of force development, which is how quickly you can produce that force, how quickly you can develop that force, right? That's your explosive ability. Additionally, if we're looking at things from an endurance-based perspective, a stronger muscle has greater levels of output, and then you can cover greater distances with less exertion, essentially, as well as building the work capacity by virtue of developing maximal strength to then develop subsequent endurance, right? So what I mean by that, so if you can squat, let's say you can squat 500 pounds. If I have you do a banded leg extension, right? If I have you sit on one of these boxes back here, throw a band around your ankles, attach it to the rack, and I have you do 100 band leg extensions. If you can squat 500 pounds, you can probably do that with a light or an average band. Okay. Now, if you can only squat 50% of that, so 250, you might only be able to do a mini or a monster mini, or you could do a light or maybe an average band, but for fewer repetitions per exertion or per bout. Okay. And when it comes to high volume stuff like that, we're looking to develop not necessarily hypertrophy, but endurance, and then connective tissue hypertrophy as well, right? So, and if we think about things from a perspective of pure physical exertion, right? How much force can I produce? The conjugate method is fantastic because it keeps you at an elevated level of intensity year-round, right? Or duty round, however you want to phrase it, right? A constant and consistent level of maximal strength and maximal output. So what would I do for maximal strength development for these particular populations? Well, depends on what issues they have, what injuries they have, what their limitations are, what their experience levels are, that kind of stuff, right? So I have two individuals right now. I have a SWAT team member, and then I have a Border Patrol representative or officer, both of whom are training here. And what we did on Sunday, which was their max effort day, was we safety squat bar squatted. Right. And the reason for that was, one, because they're both broader shouldered men, they're bigger men, so it's harder for them to get into the racks, right, without using my F8 or Sportcraft squat bar, right? And they're of different heights, so I can't put them on the same rack, right? So we go in safety squat bar because it obviously brings their hands in, it creates a handle point, okay, a much more neutral position to hold onto the bar, so it aggravates their shoulders less, and then it also creates, or it teaches them to maintain tension, maintain posture under maximal load. So we get isometric development through the musculature of the upper back, the spinal erectors, the lats, rhomboids, teres, et cetera, the whole upper back and mid-back complex through the utilization of that bar, right? We've yet to do a max effort upper session. We've done some volume pressing to both boards and for floor press. And the reason for that is not because I'm scared to have them max out on their bench, right? I'm not scared to have anybody do anything as long as they're capable of doing it. But I want to focus more on the development of their lower body and total body strength as compared to isolating their upper body strength, right? And just also their schedule hasn't allowed for it yet. But to go back before I get too tangential, so let's talk max effort lower. What would I do for the max effort lower for the law enforcement and first responder populations? Safety squat bar, box squat, right? And the reason for the box squat is it's much easier to teach. It's much easier to learn, and it's easier to recover from, right? Because it breaks up the eccentric concentric chain. You are overcoming an isometric or a static position via dynamic force, right? And so it teaches explosiveness, it teaches tension, it teaches posture and positioning, all that kind of stuff, right? And again, because of the way the bar is designed, it wants to roll you over, so it forces an isometric contraction of the upper back musculature, right? And it's also much easier, as I alluded to, on the shoulders. Most larger men who have lived in these professions for significant amount of time have shoulder injuries or issues, whether from contact, combat, or just general wear and tear, right? We also do the box squat because it's easier on your knees. Again, for the same reason, individuals who have lived in these professions for long periods of time, because of the general wear and tear and the demand of their profession, often have hip and knee issues as well as ankle issues. And so if I can mitigate incurring overuse injuries in the knees by virtue of executing a box squat, then I'm going to do so, right? And again, as I said, it's also easier to teach, it's easier to learn, it's easier to get in position with, and it's easier to recover from. We will also deadlift. One of my guys has deadlifted 405. That was his first time deadlifting in many, many years, and he pulled 405 with relative ease. So there's definitely more in the tank, but we're going to ease our way into this so we don't aggravate things. Because the thing with the tactical population or with law enforcement and first responder is that if, as a powerlifter, I get sore, and as a strength coach, if I get sore to the point where I am relatively incapable of movement, I can still do my job, right? My job is not dependent upon my ability to move through space at speed and engage with other individuals, right? I still have to be able to demonstrate movements and get into the correct positioning and posture and that kind of stuff. But if I deadlift super heavy one night and the next day I wake up with a sore lower back, it's not going to affect my ability to do my job. Whereas with these individuals, the law enforcement, first responder, border patrol agents, if they can't move, their ability to execute their duty or execute in the line of duty is severely prohibited or truncated, right? So my SWAT guy, if he can't move and if he has to engage with a suspect or chase down a suspect or breach a door or whatever it may be, and he can't do that, then that's on me, right? And that's putting him at risk and putting the entire squad or team at risk, right? So as a tactical strength and conditioning professional, you have to be very cognizant about how much volume and intensity you're exposing your operators to or your agents to. You want to push just hard enough that you drive adaptation and provide stimulus, but you don't want to push so hard that you end up negatively impacting the ability of them to do their job, right? So again, go back to max effort lower. Safety squat bar, box squat. I don't have a Duffalo bar here, otherwise we would use it. Maybe a Zercher squat. I think that's important. I think the Zercher squat gets a lot of love from the tactical community just because it's more specific. There's nothing specific about it. It's just a more challenging aspect that takes the shoulders out of it a little more and forces you to anteriorly load as compared to posterior load, which is beneficial for tactical professionals. But the Zercher squat is not some magic pill or panacea that is just perfect for the tactical community. It's a good avenue of training, but it's not a perfect one, right? I think block pulls would be a very valuable tool because I firmly believe in pulling from the floor for all populations. But again, going back to my previous statement about how can I drive adaptation and create stimulus without creating negative adaptation or pain or soreness or mitigating the likelihood of incurring thereof, then I'm going to do that. How can I do that? I'm going to do that. Right, so block pulls, mat pulls, rack pulls, reverse band stuff I think is really good because a lot of these guys are strong, but they're not as strong as they could be. And then that begs the question, like, how strong is strong enough, right? Does my SWAT guy need to be able to deadlift 600 pounds? Probably not, right? So that's not the end goal. I do firmly believe in getting people as strong as possible, but as a power lifter, my entire performance is based and predicated upon the notion of how much weight can I lift, right? I'm trying to lift maximal amounts of weight for a singular exertion. Whereas so that is like the primary focus, that is the apex of my performance, right? That's the top of my pyramid. For a SWAT member or a border patrol agent or a law enforcement officer or a first responder, firefighter, medic, whatever it is, they need maximal strength, but at potentially repeatable bouts, right? So that's not to say we need to work on maximal strength endurance where we need to pull heavy doubles, triples, or fives, right? To quote Mark Ripito. But we do need to be able to exist in the maximal ranges, but with the endurance to perform repeated bouts of exertion and effort, right? So again, I'm not afraid to pull from the floor, but it has to be used judiciously, right? Block pulls are a great place to start. Rack pulls are a great place to start. Reverse band is great. And And then I used sumo pretty exclusively when I was with my Green Berets up at First Group. I believe it is a more accessible option for teaching the deadlift. And you can argue like, well, you're already getting a squat pattern via the squat, so why would you introduce another squat pattern with the sumo deadlift as compared to doing a hinge like you would for a conventional deadlift? Well, my argument against that is that sumo is often, it's more technical, right? And because of that, it is self-limiting, right? So if we have a very strong individual who is capable of exerting high levels or amounts of force, that individual may hurt himself by expressing that force incorrectly or inefficiently, right? So if I say, hey man, I want you to go rip that deadlift conventional style and you can pull 585 or 600 pounds, you might be able to muscle it up, but what's the price you're going to pay, right? So with the sumo deadlift being a more technical movement, it is again self-limiting, so it reduces the load that you can safely and effectively and efficiently handle, and then it also prevents or it mitigates. Nothing's ever preventable, right? But things are, you can decrease the likelihood or the degree of injury or trauma that occurs from training, right? That's the whole point, getting stronger with minimal trauma or minimal injury. So I think there's a time and place for the conventional deadlift, but from a maximal perspective, the low back, the spinal erectors, the glutes, the hips, hamstrings, et cetera, the whole posterior chain has to be developed appropriately in order to handle the load that person is capable of expressing, right? Or handle the force that person is capable of expressing, right? Also, if you think about things from a pseudo-tactical perspective, the only time you're probably going to pick something up in a conventional deadlift position is if you're picking up an object, right? Obviously, right? But if I'm here and there's an object on the ground, whether a person or a sandbag or an ammo crate or whatever it may be, if I do this, I'm probably going to end up rounding, right? If I can straddle the object, get into a sumo position, and then drive with my legs, it's going to be much safer and much more effective and efficient of a movement than if I pull conventional, right? It's going to be much less awkward. Obviously, there's time and place for that kind of stuff, and at some point, you're going to have to just bend over and pick somebody or something up. But that is something that comes with exposure to training over time. And again, if I can mitigate incurred trauma, I'm going to do so, right? So that covers max effort lower. I think bands and chains are absolutely appropriate. Bands, maybe not so much because most first responders are not inherently powerlifters, right? And might not have the requisite technique to handle the eccentric overload of a band. So I would be much more open to using chains as compared to bands for the tactical professionals as far as accommodating resistance, right? I think heavy chain is a great way to train because it creates real weight as compared to bands, which are more sort of theoretical and dynamic. And so what I mean by that is that a standard chain weighs about 20 pounds, right? You can get heavier chain or lighter chain, but the chains we have here weigh roughly 20 pounds. And so if I put 3 chains on each side, that's 120 pounds of chain added to the movement, right? If I put a band on, even if I put a light band on, a light band, let's say, is 100 pounds of tension between the two of them. Let's just make up some numbers, right? Might be more, might be less, depending on the band. But that brings me to my point is that the accommodating resistance provided by chain is much more static, repeatable, and accurate as compared to that created by bands, right? So bands are subject to stretching, deformation over time. And then if you have individuals who are of different heights, they're going to get different loads, right? So my border patrol agent is shorter than my SWAT guy. And so if I put the same 2 bands on the rack, set them up the same exact way on both the rack and the barbell, so the same setup, all the things being equal, my border patrol agent is going to get far less tension than my SWAT member, just because the SWAT guy is taller, right? And so it can be difficult to standardize and regulate band tension. And that's just something you have to account for when it comes to training conjugate or programming conjugate. Understanding that there are variable load patterns or loading patterns when it comes to bands. But in order to eliminate a lot of the guesswork and the like hemming and hawing about how much tension you're actually getting at the top and like the magical, mystical band tension numbers that just sort of exist, fugazi, it's in the ether, right? I like using chains. Also, chains are way easier to set up. You just hang a feeder chain, you clip the chains to them, and you're good to go. Okay? I think like pause squats on a box would be very beneficial. Pause deadlifts, maybe not so much. I don't really see the value in that. But yeah, and then with the box squat, obviously we take our wide stance again in order to stay out of the knees as much as possible. We still train knee flexion, knee extension, right? Directly, like through band leg curls, through band leg extensions, through lunges, split squats, unilateral movements, that type of stuff. But under maximal load, I'm not a big fan of a severe degree of knee flexion, right? Obviously, they're going to be exposed to it, so logic would dictate then they should be exposed to it in the gym. But the gym is not the field, right? The gym is the place, the weight room is the place where you prepare your body for movement under load, or you expose your body to movement and motion under load. And then the field is where you take those concepts, take that strength, that force production, that rate of force development, that endurance, durability, and resilience, and you apply it to your profession, right? So that's why we do the unilateral movements. That's why we do sled drags forward and backwards. That's why we do wheelbarrow carries, all which I'll touch on later. So as far as max effort upper, I think board presses, floor press, reverse band touches are all very valuable, right? Again, I'm looking at things through the lens of what can I do to drive adaptation, to cause stimulus or create stimulus while mitigating the likelihood of incurring trauma or injury, severe trauma or injury, right? Because again, if my operators are too sore to do their job and they get deployed or they get called out on a mission, they are then a liability not only to themselves, but to their team, and they may not come home, right? And that's the stark reality of these law enforcement professions, is that there's very real danger associated with these professions, right? Even here in Sierra Vista, there's danger, right? My SWAT guy tells me stories about missions that he goes on. You know, my Border Patrol guy, he deals with border crossings, he deals with other people, right? There's always the potential for danger. And so I have to keep that in mind, that everything that I do has to be positive and productive with minimal incurred trauma, right? Incline, both low and high incline, I think is valuable. Maybe not for a max effort, but from a repeated effort perspective, so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But yeah, board press, like 1, 2, maybe 3 board. Again, we're not trying to overload the triceps from a tactical perspective for the sake of getting the triceps stronger, but we are trying to work through different ranges of motion safely, right? And to protect the shoulder, we don't want any pecs popping or tearing or anything like that. So how can I, again, reduce the likelihood of those things happening while still driving adaptation? It's a very important thing to think about when you're a tactical strength conditioning professional. As far as dynamic effort work goes, I'm not a huge believer in dynamic effort upper for the tactical populations. I've used it, has its time and place. But again, because most law enforcement professionals, whether police, SWAT, Border Patrol, they're not inherently powerlifters, so they don't have the technique, at least off the bat, to hold on to they don't have the proficiency to hold on to technique while developing a high rate of force, right? So the whole idea behind dynamic effort upper and lower is to move a weight as fast as possible versus accommodating resistance, right? You're trying to cover X amount of distance across Y amount of time and trying to reduce that Y as much as possible, right? So you're trying to produce as much force as you can, as quickly as you can, to move that bar through space. What I have found is that, especially with dynamic effort upper, it just turns into how fast can I move the bar, right? Which on one hand is the entire point and the entire intent of the dynamic effort upper. But the flip side to that, the inverse of that coin, is that how fast can you move the bar with proper technique, right? So there are ways we can train dynamic effort upper that don't involve banded or chained benching, right? We can do med ball throws, we can do med ball slams, we can do med ball punches or floor presses. We can do ballistic or plyo push-ups, band assisted or not, right? So there's a lot of ways to develop rate of force development that perhaps are more appropriate for the law enforcement profession than a banded or a chained bench, right? I think dynamic effort upper absolutely has its place when it comes to powerlifting. And then if you're also like an explosive athlete, like let's say you're a thrower, whether disc, jab, shot, like there's a time and a place for that as well. But again, we're talking about the law enforcement population, first responder population that doesn't need that rate of force development skill set within the context of their job directly, right? It can be a secondary thing that we train, maybe once every few waves, right? Every 3, 6 weeks, 9 weeks, we might throw in a dynamic effort upper wave just to tack that on and to have that capacity. But there are a multitude of other ways we can train that, right? And so that leads me then finally to dynamic effort lower. Firm believer in dynamic effort lower for the law enforcement profession, first responder professions. Again, prefer chains over bands, even though when it comes to bands versus chains, bands are often more effective at training dynamic effort lower than chains are, because bands provide the eccentric overload, meaning so a chain is just static. If you hang a chain, it's just going to sit there, right? It's just going to hang there. It's going to be 20 pounds. If I anchor a band to my rack and then to the barbell, it has that much force, whatever the tension is, it has that much force pulling that bar back down, right? So an appropriate level of band tension is going to move your body, as long as you allow it and don't fight it. If you move at the appropriate speed, is going to move your body through space faster than it naturally would be able to, right? That's the eccentric overload. Louis Simmons talked about this a lot when it came to dynamic effort lower. And the idea then is that once you have the eccentric overload and you sit on the box, right, you get what's called deformation, right? So the example that Louis uses or used and that I like to use is a basketball. If I drop a ball from this high, it's only going to have this much time to develop force, right? And it's only going to bounce this high back up, right? Because this is the distance it's covering. It absorbs and redirects force only so much, and then it comes back up to the height, right? If I throw the ball down, it has an eccentric overload, so an eccentric overspeed, essentially. There's more force going into the floor. The floor then reverses or redirects that force. The ball deforms against the floor. So when a ball bounces, it actually goes from concave to convex to concave, right? And then it rebounds with as much force as was produced on the way down. So if I throw a ball, it's going to go higher than if I just drop it, right? So the same concept applies to muscles and tendons and ligaments, right? If I come down with a certain amount of force, I pause, I'm going to be able to produce, depending on how long I sit there, right? Because force will bleed out over time. So if I sit on the box for 5, 8, 10 seconds, I'm going to have less potential energy to transfer into kinetic energy than if I sit for like a 2 or a 3 count, right? Because that energy has dissipated, the muscles have had time to reform as compared to deform, and I'm not going to be able to produce as much force. Okay, but if that band pulls me down in an overspeed, so faster than naturally capable of gravity or by gravity, I'm going to have that much force going into the box, which is then going to redistribute itself back up through my body as I produce force to go back up into my concentric phase. So if we're looking at pure speed work, right, if we're looking at moving the bar at speed for the sake of bar speed itself, bands are a much more effective way of training that. However, again, bands are difficult to set up. They're not hard, but they're more time consuming, and you have to make sure they're aligned properly, they're anchored properly, that they have sufficient tension on them. And then again, you have the height issues, right? So again, my Border Patrol agent is shorter, my SWAT team member is taller, so my SWAT guy is going to get more tension out of the same 2 bands that my Border Patrol agent is going to, right? So there's some variables across the board that you have to account for. And you can just sort of standardize for that, say, hey, we're going to go versus light bands today, and the tension is what it is, right? But that's a far less controllable factor than if you put on 80 pounds of chain, right? And then again, bands require you to actively produce force, right? You have to intentionally produce force, because if you slow down, the band tension is going to kick in and it's going to stall your progress, right? It's going to reverse your progress, or it's going to slow you down. I'm not going to use the R word. Everybody knows what I'm trying to say, right? Retard. Don't get offended. I use the word, but not in the context. Okay? So it's going to retard your progress, slow your progress, and it's going to stall you out. So bands are exponential, right? Meaning they go from 0 to 100 very quickly. Chains are incremental. They go from 0 to 20 to 40 to 60 or whatever the poundages are, right, as you stand up. So chains are much more controllable, much more predictable, much more accurate, okay? And they're just more readily accessible than bands are to most lifters, right? To most professionals rather. Most professionals look at bands and they might say, I don't know what I'm doing with that. It doesn't make sense to me. Why are we doing that? Why not just add more weight? Chains are like, okay, I can see that actually adds weight to the bar. I can hear them moving. I can feel them like unloading at the floor and then reloading as I stand up. So it just makes more sense. Okay, it's less cognitive dissonance, okay, going through your brain as you're going through the lift. But the way that I use dynamic effort lower is not necessarily for pure bar speed, at least with the tactical profession, right? I use dynamic effort lower as, yes, a way to increase rate of force development. Absolutely, right? Because we are trying to move the bar with speed and with intent. But I also use it as sort of an anaerobic conditioning, right? So we do between either 8, 12, 10, or 8 sets of 2 on squat, 10, 10, 8 sets of 1 on deadlift, or we'll do like a 5x5 or, a 5x2, whatever it may be, to develop some a low intensity conditioning protocol that doesn't involve, and what I mean by low intensity is it doesn't involve running, right? So a lot of these guys have to run, they have to be good at it, right? So we will run, but a lot of them run in their own regard or on their own time. So we don't do much of it here, right? Running, especially on pavement or especially in boots on top of that, really beats up the ankles, the shins, the knees, the femurs, and the hips and the low back, right? Especially if you're wearing kit, right? So if I can find a way to develop aerobic and anaerobic conditioning through a non-traditional means of ESD or energy system development, then I'm going to do that. So we keep our bouts of exertion very short. So I'll give, like, today my guys are going to do week 2 of their dynamic effort lower wave. So we're at 55% for 10 sets of 2. They get 6 seconds to execute their 2 repetitions, plenty of time if they're moving quickly, and they get no more than 45 seconds worth of rest. Okay, so each set is done inside of a minute. As we progress deeper into the program, as they get in better shape, more conditioned, we will decrease the rest time to about 30 seconds so they have to adapt even further, right? So again, my methodology or my thought process behind using dynamic effort lower is, yes, to increase bar speed, but also to improve conditioning. Okay, so that covers max effort, dynamic effort, and now we move into repetition effort. So repetition effort, when it comes to powerlifting, the purpose thereof is to train the musculature to improve hypertrophy, which then ultimately improves force production and then rate of force development potential, right? Because a bigger muscle has a greater cross-sectional area and has more potential to produce higher levels of force than a smaller muscle. Now, there's always outliers, right? Some dudes are really big and not that strong. Some guys are smaller but very strong, so there's always outliers, right? Neurological, how your muscles are attached, where your origin and insertions are, what your lever lengths are, that kind of stuff, right? But your standard normal human being, with your standard normal human being, your average person, a larger muscle is going to produce more force, right? So again, when it comes to powerlifting, the repetition effort is to develop the musculature responsible for being the movers of the primary competition lift, so the squat, the bench, and the deadlift. When I think about repetition effort, both lower and upper for my tactical professionals, I think about it, how can we build a built-in suit of armor, right? How can I protect joints, tendons, ligaments? How can I maximize efficiency under load, right? And then improve sub-maximal, repeatable bouts of exertion, effort, and strength. So today is dynamic effort lower. So they're going to do speed squat, speed deadlift, and they're going to do some core and some posterior chain work, right? So we're developing the core and the posterior chain not for the sake of improving their lifts, even though that is a secondary or tertiary order of effect, right? So if your hamstrings get stronger, you're going to be able to produce more force out of a box squat or in a deadlift. If your quads get stronger, same thing. If your core gets stronger, you're going to be more stable. All those things are true, right? Which then turns into I can move more weight so I get stronger over time. But again, the idea is to build durability and resilience, right? Because with the tactical professionals that I've seen and that I've worked with, more often than not, they don't get hurt in combat or in encounter or conflict, right? Absolutely does happen, especially with the Green Berets, SWAT, Border Patrol, all that stuff, absolutely, subject to line of duty related injuries. But most of the guys, especially with my Green Berets that I saw up at first group, were just banged up, right? They didn't have the durability, the endurance, the resilience, or the work capacity to handle the op tempo at which they were operating, right? And they got hurt over time, chronic use injuries, banged up knees from jumping out of helicopters, parachuting, fast roping, shoulder, low back from rucking, that kind of stuff, right? So my job as a tactical strength and conditioning professional is to develop a system, and by system I mean the body, develop the system in such a way that it is hardier and more resilient and resistant to incurring those non-contact, non-combat related injuries. So we keep our volume moderate, right? I'm a big fan of like high volume posterior chain work. So we do like 100 seated hamstring curls or 100 prone hamstring curls. We'll do GHRs. We'll do a shit ton of reverse hypers. Lots of rows, lots of pulls, that kind of stuff, and lots of core work. And when it comes to core work, you have to think about it from a 360 degree perspective, right? So many of us just, especially as men, we just see what we can see in the mirror. We just look at the front muscles, the anterior chain. We say, okay, I have a six pack, so that means I'm strong or that I'm fit. Not necessarily true, right? The core is designed, the trunk is designed as a 360 degree movable connector, essentially, connection point or bridge between your upper half and your lower half, right? So your trunk, in my opinion, is right about here, and then where your rib cage starts, that's about where your upper body starts, okay? It all bleeds together, yes, because you're one connected unit, right? But if you want to break it down into thirds or into segments, that's what I would say. So when I think about training core for the tactical professions, I think about 360 degrees. Flexion extension, movement through the sagittal plane, right? Yep, this is frontal, sagittal, and then through the transverse plane as well, right? So front to back, side to side, bending side to side, and then rotation side to side, right? As well as anti-rotation, isometric positioning. So planks, pale-off presses, that kind of stuff, right? And you just have to be cognizant and pay attention to how you're programming those things out and when you throw them in, right? If you know that like, hey, they have a mission coming up or they might have a mission coming up, we can't do a bunch of GHR sit-ups, which are a super effective training methodology or modality rather, but are very intense. So they can make you very sore. And again, if you are too sore to operate, you become a liability, right? So as far as how you would break down a tactical conjugate method or training week, I would say day one is always max effort lower. Day two is your repetition effort upper. Day three is your dynamic effort lower. And day four is your max effort upper, right? So if you do like a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday split, right now my guys, because their schedules are like Sunday through Wednesday, so we pack a lot into like 3 or 4 days, depending on their schedules, and they have 3 to 4 days to recover from training while they work. Grip strength and grip endurance are also two very big factors when it comes to training in the tactical populations. So not only do you need the capacity to produce force from a grip strength perspective, but you also need to be able to maintain that grip under time or over time under load, right? So we do wheelbarrow carries, we do dumbbell farmer walks, we do pull-ups, chin-ups, hangs, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, very important that you train all aspects of the system, all aspects of the body when it comes to training tactical professionals, okay? So that wraps things up for today. Thanks for checking in. You can follow me on Hammer Strength or at Hammer SNC on Instagram, www.hammersnc.com, hammersnc@gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook, Hammer Strength and Conditioning, and then here on YouTube. So as always, thanks for checking me out. Don't waste the pain.